Okay, everybody, welcome back to our last, I promise this time, our last Christianity pre-recorded lecture. We'll meet briefly for a bit of a discussion to make sure that everybody has what they need to get from all these lessons on Monday. But basically, all we're going to do is go through the last bits here and bring it up to the present, talking about modern movements. So number one, we sort of cross into modernity in the time of European colonialism. And along with colonialism, you get the growth of missionary movements. You get this idea that as these Western colonial powers come into contact with other peoples who are not familiar with Christianity, there are many people who authentically believe that their responsibility is therefore to spread Christianity so that these people can come to know God and potentially have eternal salvation, so that they can avoid the idea of in some cases, you have certain types of Christianity that believe that a person who is not saved might burn in hell for all eternity. So you have the idea that maybe, it would be nice to make sure that you spread that Christianity to these people. In any case, you have the spread of missionary movements that begins that begins in particular in earnest a little bit after the colonial period begins. Now, what many of you all are familiar with is going to be something that we might call evangelicalism. And this is something that grew out of the Great Awakening and then the Second Great Awakening in the United States. You also see some development of it in England with the Wesleys and others that are associated with these things as well. But the evangelicalism gets its name because it is associated with evangelism. And again, remember, evangel comes from the Greek word for gospel. And evangelism is spreading the gospel through preaching. And so you have in the various evangelical movements, you have an emphasis on the need for Christians not only to be born into church and born to Christian parents and born into a church and, sort of go through the motions, but instead to be born again, to actually receive the grace of God in a way that is actually it's a conversion experience, essentially. So whether you were born to Christian parents, whether you grew up in the church or whatever, it does not matter. What matters is that you at some point need to be born again. And this is from John 3:3, which actually there's an irony here in that Jesus uses a word anothen in John 3:3, that you must be born anothen. And Jesus means from above, but anothen can either mean from above or again. It means both of them, but you have to determine which it means by context. And Nicodemus, who Jesus is talking to, misunderstands Jesus as saying again and reacts to that like, wait, whoa, you're saying I gotta like be back in my mother's womb again? Like, that's some strange stuff, man. And Jesus then takes the rest of the chapter to explain that he means from above, and yet still you have now the terminology of born again is what's used here. So there's a little bit of an irony there. But the other thing that this means, though, is that you have a strong emphasis on the need for a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. This is a quasi-mystical kind of notion that it's not enough, again, to attend church, to participate in the Eucharist, to participate in the sacraments and all of these things. You need to have a personal, mystical relationship with Jesus in order to really be where you should be with God. And this is ultimately the most influential Christian movement in the modern era. It is super influential in the United States. It has become extremely influential through actually something we'll talk about later, the Pentecostal movement in Latin America and in South America and in Africa, and also even in South Asia and Southeast Asia. This has been the most influential Christian movement in the modern era, without question. Now, alongside that, you had a growth of Christian liberalism. So in the time of, this is post-Enlightenment, the Enlightenment really calls into question a lot of the miraculous qualities that we see in the Bible. That you have many of these Enlightenment figures begin to read the Bible, and they read it differently from how you might read it in the context of a church, and especially before the movable type printing press, most people didn't read the Bible. They experienced the Bible through public readings in the church, after which they were told what it meant and how that ultimately worked out for the salvation of their souls. Well, then after the movable type printing press, you have a more literate society, and more people are reading the Bible themselves, many of whom are subjecting it to the same kinds of tests and expectations that you would subject other literature to. And you get things that are noticed about it that it's like, wait, why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar? And why does it appear that they're verbatim here, and then you've got this change that's here, and this is different from this, and is that a contradiction? And you get lots of these things that begin to get questioned by these highly intellectual figures. Now, many of these people retain their at least nominal Christianity. They retain their identity. They continue to identify themselves as Christians, but they begin to question a lot of the traditional theology of Christianity. For example, the idea of whether miracles can actually happen. I mean, does the supernatural actually happen? When it says Jesus walked on the water, does that mean that like Jesus literally like walked on the water? I mean, we're not talking about like skating here, right? We're not talking about like frozen water. Like, people don't walk on water. And, like virgin birth, right? You know how babies are made? Like, it doesn't really happen with virgins. And, and then you've got, well, do we really think about like Jesus ascended to heaven up there when we know that the earth is a sphere? I mean, where is up there? I mean, do dead bodies resurrect? I mean, that doesn't seem right. So you have a questioning of a lot of the supernatural aspects, and also a questioning of the inspiration and authority of the Bible in general. And so you have these people, they still believe that the fundamental tenets of Christianity, particularly the ethical portion of Christianity, is valuable, and the teachings of Jesus are valuable, but they're trying to dissociate that from what they see as the sort of mythological framework that was necessary for pre-modern individuals, that, we've outgrown this mythological, we don't need to believe in these silly miracles anymore. We can get the point about loving your neighbor and all that without needing all those things. And so, and along with that, many of these Christian liberals, and most of them, by the way, were in traditional Protestant denominations, particularly Lutherans and some in the Church of England, and so on. But you had many of these people, they embraced this humanist idea that human beings are essentially and fundamentally good. It just some people then just sort of get turned wrong or become bad over time. And so this all sort of this goes against a lot of traditional notions, particularly in Western Christianity, and challenges a lot of that. That grows up really in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then in particular. And then by the time you get to the early 20th century, this Christian liberalism is a very strong movement. You see this especially coming out of Germany, and growing into the United States and in France. France is a little bit less Christian overall, but you get a lot of this Christian liberalism that's growing. And there ends up being a response to this Christian liberalism from a group that begins to call themselves fundamentalists. And so this is in the early 1900s. These fundamentalists are people who are growing out of evangelicalism. They're growing out of this movement where they're spreading the gospel through preaching, the need to be born again, the need for a personal relationship with Jesus. And in reaction against liberal theology, and also things like the theory of evolution and studying the Bible in an academic rather than in a religious fashion, they decide that they're going to emphasize the non-negotiables, that these are the things that make a person Christian, that if you don't believe these things, then you're not really Christian. You might call yourself that, but you're not really Christian. These are the fundamentals. And in particular, there are 5 of them. The notion of the inerrancy of the Bible is first, that the Bible is the true authority for life and practice. And if you're questioning the Bible, then you're questioning the foundation of Christianity. And you can see that fundamentalism is fundamentally a Protestant movement in this regard, because this is something that Catholics are not necessarily committed to, for example, or Eastern Orthodox are not committed to the inerrancy of the Bible in this way, because the Bible is itself the product of Christian tradition. They would point out that the Bible as we have it, didn't exist until the 4th century. Well, what about the Christians before that? They don't fit in the fundamentals here since they don't have it. So, that's the rebuttal of those people. But for the fundamentalists, they're saying look, now that we have the Bible, it's inerrant. And if you question that, then your Christianity is in question, because this is one of the fundamentals. Beyond that, the divinity of Christ and his virgin birth, those are non-negotiables. If you don't believe in those, then you're probably not a Christian for these people. The same thing for Christ's atonement for human sin on the cross. If you don't believe that Jesus came and died on the cross for humanity's sin to make atonement for their sin, then you're out. And then finally, you have the bodily resurrection of Jesus and the bodily second coming of Jesus. These are the 5 non-negotiables of fundamentalism. And so this ends up being central to this movement, this fundamentalist movement, where basically this serves as a reaction against Christian liberalism. And for the most part, these fundamentalists kind of are they're apolitical. They're concerned with their own groups rather than with political movements and that sort of thing. And that's really true until you get to about the late 70s, early 80s, when you start seeing many of these fundamentalists coming out as part of the moral majority. And now a lot of the evangelicals that you hear about are actually part of this sort of fundamentalist movement that's now becoming a little bit more political in its scope and working from there. In parallel with fundamentalism, you have also another movement called Pentecostalism. And this, again, begins in the early 1900s. Pentecostalism takes its name from Acts 2. Remember, we talked about how at the day of Pentecost, in the Jewish tradition, this celebrates the law being given to the people of God, to the people of Israel. And in the Christian tradition, on the day of Pentecost, the church receives the Holy Spirit. And this is narrated in Acts chapter 2. And this is where, when these people, these 120 Christians who are waiting on the Holy Spirit, they receive the Holy Spirit. All of a sudden, they begin to speak in tongues, is what it's called, but basically speak in other languages. And so, in the early 1900s, there were Christians that were reading this, and they decided, look, this can't be something that's just limited to one generation there. Why are we not seeing people today who are speaking in other languages and receiving the Spirit this way? And in consequence, people began to seek for that particular gift from God, and many people began to then speak in tongues, or this what's often called glossolalia. So this is another way of referring to that, a technical term for it. The Greek word for tongue is glossa. So conversion then is not enough for the Pentecostals. Conversion needs to be followed by a baptism of the Holy Spirit. So you can be baptized in water, but what you really need is the second touch, so that you are immersed in the Holy Spirit, and that gives you special power, including the ability to speak in tongues. And Pentecostals believe in the continued availability of the various spiritual gifts that are listed in the New Testament. So for Pentecostals, people still can hear God and prophesy in the same way that any figure in the Bible could. People can still heal in the same way that, someone in the Bible, it talks about, somebody laying hands on somebody and that person getting up and walking and being healed, or having, you've got the notion of people praying for limbs to regrow and all of this. And they believe that these sorts of things can and do happen. This is a highly experiential and enthusiastic form of Christianity. It is focused on the experience of God and of the Holy Spirit. And when you go to a Pentecostal church service, you know it. you're gonna hear people shouting. You're gonna hear people talking in what sounds like indecipherable language. You're gonna hear all sorts of things. And this now is the fastest growing Christian movement in the world, particularly in the global South. And some of the churches that you might have heard of that are from this movement are the Assemblies of God, the Church of God based in Cleveland, Tennessee, the Church of the Foursquare Gospel, and lots of non-denominational churches come straight out of this Pentecostal movement. And so this is, again, and Pentecostals really grow out of evangelicalism. So really most Pentecostals are evangelical, though actually Pentecostalism you have a second movement that happens around the middle of the 20th century, where traditional denominations such as Lutherans or Anglicans or Catholics or Eastern Orthodox, they begin to have their own Pentecostal experiences, many people from those churches, and so that's regarded as the charismatic movement. These are people who are receiving, again, the grace of God through the Spirit, this baptism of the Holy Spirit, but they're not part of traditional Pentecostal churches, these Assemblies of God or other non-denominational churches. They're part of more traditional churches, though with Pentecostal experience, or what might be called charismatic experience, it tends to be called. So that's another thing, but this is, like I said, the fastest growing Christian movement in the world without any question. And this matters because, in particular, its power in the global South, because right now, 60% of Christians in the world live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So let me repeat that again. 60% of Christians alive today are not white Europeans. They're not Americans. They are people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And around 2050, only about 20% of Christians are projected to be non-Hispanic whites. So you think about what direction the Christian movement is going. It's not going in the direction of European or American-dominated Christianity. It is growing much more in the global South. And for what it's worth, Christianity in the global South tends to be much more conservative. That's already led to some issues here in the United States, where there are people who are part of, say, the Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church, just split over this, where Americans are taking a much more liberal approach to certain theological issues and to things like sexual behavior. And the Christians in the global South are not towing the Western line on this. They're saying, no, we're going to follow a more traditional conservative approach here. And that's led to a lot of conflict. So we will get together and we're going to discuss a few additional things in our last little discussion session. I don't expect it to take all the time, but thanks for watching all these, and hopefully this helps give you a good framework to understand the various differences across Christian denominations and everything. Either way, this should be a good warm-up for the things that you'll need to know for the rest of the semester.